In 1907, a German engineer named August Natterer experienced something so overwhelming that it would shape the rest of his life. He later claimed that for exactly 30 minutes, more than 10,000 images flashed before his eyes. Not like ordinary thoughts or memories, but like a projector had suddenly switched on inside his mind. One image followed another at terrifying speed. He saw divine figures, demons, angels, strange symbols he could not understand, and scenes he believed belonged to the Last Judgment. But among everything he saw, one figure seems to have haunted him more than the rest. A terrifying woman he described as the witch who created the universe. To Natterer, none of this felt imaginary. It felt completely real. And after the episode, his life began to collapse. Years later, inside a psychiatric hospital, he would attempt something extraordinary, to draw what he had seen. And one of those drawings may be the strangest record of that experience. After one of the most intense psychotic episodes, Natterer attempted to take his own life and was eventually admitted to a psychiatric hospital where he was later diagnosed with schizophrenia. But inside the hospital, he began doing something unusual. He tried to reconstruct the visions that had overwhelmed him years earlier, one image at a time. One of the most unsettling results was a drawing known as "My Eyes at the Moment of the Apparition." At first it seems almost empty. Two eyes floating alone on a blank sheet of paper. No face, no body, no background. And the two eyes are not identical. One has a dark, simple center. The other is built from several concentric rings, almost like a lens, a mechanism, or some kind of diagram. That difference matters because Natterer had been trained as an engineer. Even while describing an experience of overwhelming chaos, he seemed to record it through geometry, symmetry, and structure. Perhaps the strangest thing about the drawing is that it does not really feel like a portrait of a man. It feels more like a portrait of the act of seeing itself. What if these eyes were not meant to show us what Natterer looked like, but what it felt like to have images forced into his perception? And without Hans Prinzhorn, drawings like this might have disappeared completely. The man who preserved much of this strange legacy was Hans Prinzhorn, a psychiatrist and art historian who believed that drawings made inside psychiatric hospitals deserved to be taken seriously. To him, these works were not simply symptoms, delusions, or medical curiosities. They could also be art, perhaps even a particularly direct form of human expression. In the early 20th century, Prinzhorn began contacting psychiatric hospitals and asking doctors to send him whatever their patients had created. Drawings, paintings, sculptures, anything. His collection eventually included works from more than 450 patients and thousands of individual pieces. In 1922, he published his findings in a book titled Artistry of the Mentally Ill. And hidden among this enormous archive were the drawings of August Natterer. What made Natterer stand out was not simply that his images were unusual, it was that many of them seemed to belong to the same private world, one filled with symbols, transformations, religious visions, and recurring figures. And one of those recurring figures would become the subject of perhaps his most famous surviving image, the witch he believed had created the universe. Among Natterer's surviving works, one image is especially difficult to forget. He called it The Witch's Head. Created in 1915, the drawing appears at first to be a landscape. But once you notice the second image hidden inside it, the entire scene changes. The large lake becomes a face. A pier forms a ribbon at the neck. A boulevard turns into the brim of a hat. Together, the landscape transforms into the silhouette of a woman. And there is an even stranger detail. Beneath the covering of her head, Natterer drew what appear to be the fissures between the bones of a skull. This was not just any woman. According to Natterer's own account, the witch had appeared during his visions, and he believed she was the creator of the universe. That may explain why the figure returned again and again in his drawings. He was not inventing a character for audiences. He seemed to be trying to reconstruct something that, to him, had already appeared as reality. Decades later, when the witch's head was shown in a major touring exhibition of the Prinzhorn collection in 1980 and 1981, it became one of the collection's most widely reproduced images. Critics even compared its double image to the work of Giuseppe Arcimboldo, an artist famous centuries earlier for constructing faces from unexpected objects. But the strangest part of Natterer's story is that these drawings would eventually influence artists far beyond the walls of the psychiatric hospital. What Prinzhorn had collected in Heidelberg was no longer just a medical archive. By the 1920s, it had begun to enter the imagination of the wider art world. French poet Paul Éluard would later describe the collection as the best picture book that has ever existed. For the Surrealists, these images offered something they were already searching for: art that seemed less controlled by convention, academic rules, or ordinary logic. Prinzhorn's collection became a quiet source of inspiration for artists including Paul Klee, Max Ernst, Alfred Kubin, and Jean Dubuffet. Dubuffet later coined the term art brut for artistic expression created outside conventional cultural systems, including work produced by psychiatric patients. In 1972, art critic Roger Cardinal introduced the English term outsider art, which eventually came to include self-taught artists far beyond psychiatric institutions. So the drawings Prinzhorn had once rescued from hospital wards helped challenge a much larger question: who gets to decide what counts as art? But just as these works were beginning to gain cultural importance, a political regime was about to label them as something entirely different: degenerate. By the 1930s, the same kind of art that had fascinated Prinzhorn and inspired modern artists was being targeted by the Nazi regime. In 1937, Hitler's government organized the infamous exhibition known as Degenerate Art. Its purpose was not to understand these works, but to ridicule them. Abstract, expressionist, and surrealist art was attacked for failing to fit Nazi ideas of beauty, culture, and racial purity. And works created by psychiatric patients were placed in the same category. For the Nazis, these drawings were not evidence of creativity. They were presented as visual proof of what the regime called spiritual degeneration. Natterer was especially vulnerable. He was both a psychiatric patient and an artist whose work did not fit conventional academic standards. In the eyes of the regime, that made him an ideal target. Many works connected to this world were mocked, censored, hidden, or destroyed, and much of Natterer's own artistic legacy disappeared with them. That is one reason his name remained obscure for decades. If Prinzhorn had not collected these works before the Nazis came to power, we might have almost no visual record of Natterer today. But one mystery remained preserved. What exactly had he seen that day in 1907? According to Natterer, the experience began with something strangely simple: a bright white spot in the sky. He said the spot seemed to stop the clouds around it. Then images began appearing inside it, one after another, thousands of them moving with the speed of a rapid slideshow. He saw divine figures, scenes of war, entire continents, monuments, and enormous castles. The images appeared huge, vivid in form, yet almost without color. To Natterer, these were not random hallucinations. He believed he was being shown part of the Last Judgment. In his interpretation, the vision had been revealed because Christ had been unable to complete the work of salvation. What he saw was not merely strange, it carried for him a cosmic meaning. The experience overwhelmed him and marked the beginning of a severe mental health crisis. Over the next 26 years, he would spend much of his life in psychiatric institutions. Natterer died in 1933 from heart failure, but the images he tried to reconstruct survived him, and that leaves a difficult question. When the brain creates connections that feel completely real, where does illness end and expression begin? Recent studies have suggested that conditions such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder may sometimes be associated with a phenomenon known as brain hyperconnectivity. In simple terms, the brain may form unusual connections between ideas, images, and patterns that would not normally be linked together. In some cases, those unusual associations may appear in highly original forms of expression. But this does not mean that mental illness creates art, and it does not mean suffering should be romanticized. Natterer's drawings matter for a different reason. They show how a person experiencing an extreme mental state tried to give form to something that words could barely contain. In my eyes, at the moment of the apparition, he reduced the experience to vision itself. In The Witch's Head, he transformed a landscape into the figure that had haunted his visions. These works do not ask us to celebrate the illness. They ask us to recognize the attempt to communicate through it. And that distinction leads to the final question Natterer's story leaves behind. August Natterer was not a tortured genius who simply turned madness into inspiration. He was a man living with a severe condition, trying to record what was happening inside his own mind. What makes his work so unsettling is not that it came from illness, but that it gives us a glimpse into a reality that, for him, felt completely undeniable. The eyes, the witch, the impossible landscapes. These were attempts to translate an inner experience into something another person could actually see. And perhaps that is why these drawings still disturb us more than a century later. They sit somewhere between document, memory, vision, and art. So here is the question Natterer leaves us with. How much can a troubled mind perceive that the rest of us may never be able to imagine? Let me know what you think in the comments.